Greetings! My God, what are you doing?
Hey, hope your internet's going well. Let's talk about Half-Life. Half-Life is a first-person shooter developed by Valve and released in November of 1998. First-person shooters were constantly evolving during the 90s through many different ways, like their jump to the third dimension with Quake, or their sense of scale and immersion in Unreal. But Half-Life is different. Half-Life didn't move the genre forward through some new groundbreaking technology or with some fancy lighting. Instead, Half-Life showed everyone that an FPS game could be more than just shooting at enemies in cool places while a great soundtrack plays. It showed everyone that the story in a first-person shooter doesn't have to be an afterthought. This is my review of Half-Life. I first want to start with how Half-Life holds up today on modern PC software. In case you don't know, most older games from this time usually require some kind of source port or modification to get them at a good, playable experience. Half-Life, though, has withstood the test of time incredibly well. I didn't have to do a single thing to this game after the initial install. I simply opened it up, set my video resolution to something not straight out of 1998, adjusted a couple of mouse settings, and that was it. No source ports, no mods, no community-made patches, it just worked. Now obviously having to install those things for an old game isn't a big deal and doesn't usually take much time, but it really is nice being able to just open a game and have it work right out of the box. Sure, I could have installed some HD texture pack or something like that, but my point is that I didn't have to. The only modification I did decide to make was adding a launch command in Steam that allows me to get a wider field of view. I personally can't stand a super narrow FOV in first-person games, but that's just personal preference. Alright, let's get into the story.
Good morning, and welcome to the Black Mesa Transit System.
Half-Life begins with you on board a tram, headed to a place called Black Mesa. During this, text appears on screen that fills you in on who you are and why you're here. You play as Gordon Freeman, a theoretical physicist who works for Black Mesa. Soon after you arrive at the facility, you discover that there has been a large system crash due to an experiment the other scientists are running. You're told to get into your hazmat suit and make your way there as fast as possible. During this time, you are able to explore a small section of the facility. You can talk to scientists, look around for secret items, and of course...
My God, what are you doing?
When you're done looking around, it's time to head down to where the experiment is being conducted. As you make your way there, you start to get the feeling that something is off, and that this isn't going to be a simple routine procedure. You'll eventually make your way into this chamber where the scientists want you to push this crystal into the center. Right after you do so, this happens. That was what is known as a resonance cascade. Now I'm not a science guy at all, but the basic definition of that is a rift that connects two different worlds together and allows life to travel between the two. As we make our way out of the chamber, we immediately see the danger caused to the facility from the event. Machines are on fire, people are dead, and there's aliens from another world pouring in. Your objective is now clear. Make your way to the alien homeworld and close the rift connecting the two worlds together. Right off the bat, Half-Life makes a very clear statement that it is not going to be like every other first-person shooter up to this point. The story is front and center, rather than something that feels phoned in just to say that it has a story. Now obviously FPS games have had stories before this. That itself is nothing new. What's new is the way that the story is told. In pretty much every shooter before this, the story was either told to you through a massive wall of text in between levels, or through audio recordings. In Half-Life though, the story is what fuels the entire experience from start to finish. Now don't get me wrong, this isn't an interactive movie or anything. The story itself is pretty basic, and almost all of the story beats happen in the beginning and end. Half-Life isn't trying to give you a super deep narrative with insane lore and rich character interaction. It's trying to immerse you in a setting, and for what it sets out to do, I think it absolutely nails it. Let's talk about the gameplay next. Half-Life's gameplay, like the story, is also quite different compared to what came before it. In general, Half-Life is a much slower paced game compared to the likes of Quake, Doom, Unreal, and most other 90s shooters. You're not going to be bunny hopping at 90 miles an hour while shooting rockets at 10 different enemies like you might do in those games. Instead, Half-Life has much more of an emphasis on careful, strategic play. That's because you physically don't move near as fast as you do in those games, and because of the way that the level design is laid out. You're never going to want to just run into a large room, guns blazing. Rather, you're going to want to take your time to examine the space and listen for what might be waiting for you there. It then becomes all about figuring out what the best move is for dealing with those enemies. Sometimes it's going to be quickly poking around a corner and getting a couple shots off before returning to cover and reloading. Other times it's going to be chucking a grenade in order to get them out. And other times it will just be getting out a good old-fashioned shotgun and engaging your enemies at close range. This more complex combat also applies to other elements of Half-Life, like its level design. You generally have to interact with your environment more in this game compared to most other 90s shooters. For example, sometimes you'll have to push a block somewhere in order to reach a place that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. Or sometimes you'll have to go activate a power switch in order to get a lift working. You know, stuff like that. It's not a massive difference over just hitting a switch or finding a key like in other shooters, but it does help give Half-Life a unique sense of progression and reinforces that feeling of being in the shoes of Gordon Freeman. Right from the start, it's obvious that Half-Life has a much different design philosophy when put next to other shooters. The structure is similar to Quake 2 in a way, because of the ability to go back and forth between certain sections, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. Half-Life is a much more linear game compared to its competition. You're never going to find yourself getting lost for minutes on end as you wander around looking for clues on how to progress. From start to finish, you are naturally guided along a path that sees you moving from location to location, fighting enemies and solving very simple puzzles along the way. Location variety is something that I do think is a bit lacking in Half-Life though, unfortunately. You really have 3 main locations that you'll visit. Those include the facility itself, which is by far where you'll be the most, outside, and Zen. The facility levels can really start to blend together after a while, given how similar they all look, so I do wish there was just a bit more location variety. The outdoor levels come in around the halfway mark, and it's a very nice change of pace compared to where you've been up until that point. But then there's Zen. Zen is the alien homeworld that you eventually travel to towards the very end of the game. Look, the quality of Zen has been debated back and forth for pretty much as long as this game has existed. If you don't know the story, basically Zen is a very rushed set of levels that the developers of Half-Life have stated didn't come out the way that they wanted them to. That's primarily because of the stark contrast between this area and every other area that you have been to up until this point. Zen is nothing more than a bunch of floating platforms that you awkwardly jump from as you make your way to the final boss, fighting enemies along the way. I personally have come to actually quite like this area, because I enjoy the change of pace, but I will not deny that this area is pretty awful for people playing this game for the first time. In November of 1999, an expansion for Half-Life was released called Half-Life Opposing Force. This and the other expansion that we'll get into after are also quite unique as far as 90s expansions go. That's because it's not a sequel to Half-Life 1, where you play as Gordon Freeman again. Instead, you actually get to experience the Black Mesa incident from a completely different faction. In Opposing Force, you play as a soldier named Adrian Shepard. Shortly after the incident occurred at Black Mesa, the military was called in to resolve the situation, and that's right where we begin. Before that though, I would highly recommend doing the training level for this expansion. The training level for the base game is pretty boring and unnecessary, but it's pretty cool here. It starts off with a drill instructor scene, which are always great.
Corporal Shepard, huh? Looks more like Corporal Dog Meat to me!
You'll then go through a series of trials that teach you about the new mechanics and weapons that you'll be using, such as night vision and the new sniper rifle. Once you're done with that, you can start with the main campaign. We begin with a helicopter ride on the way to the Black Mesa facility, when suddenly, everything goes wrong. Your objective now is to find and capture Gordon for questioning, through any means necessary. That doesn't last long though, as your goal quickly changes to just simply getting out of the facility alive so that it can be missile striked. What follows is about 3 to 4 hours of the same great gameplay from Half-Life, with a unique military spin on the whole thing. You'll get to use all of your new equipment, and even some new weapons here and there. You'll also need to interact with your fellow soldiers in order to progress at certain points. It's a great expansion, and one that I would highly recommend to anyone looking for more Half-Life. The second and final expansion for Half-Life was released in June of 2001, titled Half-Life Blue Shift. This expansion is similar to Opposing Force, given that you play as someone completely new. Here we take control of Barney Calhoun, a security officer for Black Mesa. You can actually see this character in Half-Life 1 if you're paying attention at the very beginning. There really isn't a whole lot to say for this expansion, it's pretty much just more Half-Life. It's way shorter than Opposing Force, coming in at about 1.5 to 2 hours. It also doesn't have any new weapons to use or new enemies to face like Opposing Force does. It's also a lot more puzzle focused than the other two, which does help it stand out a little bit. I definitely think that this is the least interesting part of the Half-Life 1 trilogy, but it's still a solid extra piece of content that any fan of Half-Life won't want to miss. And that's Half-Life. There's very few games in this industry that have completely changed the way that we think of what a video game can be, but Half-Life is one of them, and I think it's one that everyone should experience at least once. Consider joining me next time where I'll be taking a look at its sequel, Half-Life 2. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.